Welcome back, guys, and on today's episode of Big Boy Builds, I'm going to show you how to transform this 3D printed bust of Thanos into this guy right here. This is a faux bronze finish that I applied some washes to, and the underlaying structure here is that 3D print you just saw. But here you'll see that it added some texture and we added some color and made it to look more like that bronze finish. Now this is a figure that I would love to have on my desk, on my computer desk. Now the figure, how it comes, is actually a bit taller. This base extends down on the bottom. There's an Avengers logo, and it's a little more ornate. But for my purposes, I wanted to actually have just a bust, focus more on just from the chest up, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, I have an old 3D printer. The build volume is not that big, so I wanted to maximize the size that I could print it. And second, I wanted to focus on the details of the head. I just think it's a really cool sculpt. It's an amazing figure, and I just really wanted to highlight that. And the bigger you print in this method that I'm using for making that hammered bronze kind of finish look, the bigger the object, the nicer that finish comes out. First things first, I want to show you that even on a failed print, this print, as you see right here, there's all these little fringes that are down here. It's because I forgot to turn on my support material, add support material, my 3D print. And that's totally okay, because some of these things that otherwise would be a mistake, we could use to our advantage. I'm going to trim these guys out. I'm going to use them to actually hold the material. And I'm going to start first by showing you what the basic process is and what materials we're going to use for this guy. We'll start with this base. It's 3D printed. I use the low quality settings on my 3D printer, and that's for a specific reason. I want to make sure that we have those 3D print lines on this, because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to put clay, polymer clay on top, and we want something to grab onto the surface. If it's too smooth, if it's too perfect, then the clay has a hard time grabbing on. Another great advantage of printing in really low settings is that it prints really fast. A print like this took about 7.5 hours to do on my printer. If I were to increase the settings to the maximum at a 0.1 millimeter, this could have taken 20 some odd hours to print easily. And so we start off with the base print, and I'm going to be using Sculpey as the polymer clay that I'm going to start adding on, and I'll show you how I do that in a second. And I like the black. And the reason why I like the black is because I want it to be in contrast with my 3D print color. It helps seize what areas I've covered and what areas I haven't covered. So if there's tiny little gaps and holes, it's easy to see when there's a high contrast between the material color and the clay that you're adding on top. Another great benefit of using black, if I ever were to scratch this once it's done, the scratches are dark. Imagine if you were to use a red or a yellow or some really light color, and we have paint on top and you scratch it, you really don't want to see a light color come on. So the black clay helps hide some of the scratches or make them less noticeable in case your figure ever gets scratched. We're going to be using that. We're going to be using just a simple dish just to put our clay, and I'll show you how I cut it and now I use it to start applying to the figure. We have some paint. I'm using just craft store-bought paint, nothing really special about these. I want to use an antique gold as the base for the bronze. Then I'm going to be adding a wash of black and a wash of brown. Just layered. First the brown just to give it some tones and tone down the gold, and then I'm going to use the black just to get into hit those recesses like I've done in some of my other videos. And then at the end, I might decide to do a patina or some sort of light wash, and I'll show you what colors once I decide if I'm going to do those for there. Other tools I'm going to use, an X-Acto just to cut some of the clay. I have this tool that I'm going to use as an applicator. You could use something like this, or you could use, there's sculpting tools that you can actually get that have some sort of chiseled end. This will work just as well. I've used this one before. You want something just with a nice hard end that you can actually push, and you'll see how you start applying the clay onto the figure. And lastly, I have an embossing heat gun. And what this does is basically provides just a controlled amount of hot air. Since you can't really bake this 3D model, it would melt like you normally would do with Sculpey. And since the Sculpey layer that you're applying is really thin, then what you would do to harden it is actually use this heat gun to harden just the surface. You want this to be hot enough so that it actually bakes the clay essentially right on the model, and you don't have to stick it in an oven. And that does it for the tools that we're going to use. We're going to start now by applying the first layer of the oven baked clay of the Sculpey right on top of the figure. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut some thin pieces. I'll show you here on this little dish. I want to basically go ahead and get my X-Acto and cut out just some really thin kind of slices of it, because I'm going to make essentially little, let's see, about maybe 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch. I want to go down and I'm going to cut thin slice right off. And then this slice, I'm gonna go ahead and cut into strips just so I could work a little bit easier. Now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna cut one, I'm gonna cut two just so I could have enough to get started. I'm gonna take now the slices that I've cut, I'm gonna cut them into little strips. And again, these could be the same, about 1/8 of an inch, so that you're basically making little square strips like this of the polymer clay. They don't have to be perfect, and that imperfection also helps give some variance to the clay that you're adding. You don't want it to be too uniform because then it starts looking like a pattern. But you'll see in a moment how this helps and gets us into the part of adding the clay. So I'm gonna use it, keep it like that. I'm going to place this down here just so you see where I'm grabbing from. And I'm gonna start in a tricky place. I'm gonna start somewhere around the eyes. I like to get this area in first sometimes just so it gives me the feel and I know that I'm moving in the right direction. And I'm going to grab one of the tools that I mentioned before, and I'm just going to grab a small bit of clay. And you're gonna see by what I have actually on this tool that it's not a whole lot. And what you wanna do is you wanna grab it, you wanna push it onto the surface so that it sticks. Now that it's sticking on there, it's grabbing onto all those little layer lines. And now you wanna go ahead and push in different motions and in different directions. Give it some more of a hand randomized feel to how you're adding the clay. Now the trick, and definitely the technique here, is to keep the underlying shape. You don't want to get too thick on the clay that you're adding. Now we're going to lose a little bit of detail on the model itself because the clay, especially in this mode that you're trying to give it more of a hammered and hand sculpted look, you're not going to be able to capture all that, but we're going to get the jits and you're going to get the idea of what the sculpt was under it. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start adding these, and as I keep adding pieces, I don't all start radiate from the center. I kind of start from different areas and meet up just to keep a randomized look to the sculpt. And you'll start seeing how you can start uniting these pieces and start making it look like it was a bronze sculpted, more hand sculpted look for the finish. I'm gonna start building up all these areas and try to get a good area covered. Okay, now that I have already covered with the polymer clay the face, the head, most of the head and some of the neck, I'm going to now harden this part of the polymer clay. And I want to do this because if I want to continue working on the rest of the bust, I don't want to put my fingerprints on this while I'm working on the rest of the figure. So we're going to harden this top part here and kind of get it down to about where the neck is. Still leave the edges soft so I could still finish applying the clay, but I'm able to then be able to grab it afterwards by the neck and finish using so I could add the rest of the clay to the figure. And once again, the tool that I'm going to use for this is the burnishing dryer. Essentially, it's a small heat gun that has a smaller nozzle that concentrates the heat. And you will see that as I start applying this, I'm not going to leave the hot jet of air coming out of this embossing tool coming out to be to the front too much in one spot. You can reach the point where if you leave the heat and you apply the heat for too long, your 3D model becomes soft under the clay. And it's just a warning to be very careful if it does happen so you don't distort your model. And once you reach a certain point, the polymer clay will change color on the surface. It will change from the shiny surface to a more matte finish. And that's how you know you've reached the point where the polymer clay has hardened a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do that. You'll see me go ahead and apply it to most of this area, and then we'll continue working from there. Okay, now you will see the difference between this side of the face and this side of the face. You can see how that has a sheen. It's kind of reflective, and the area that's already dry, it's more of a matte finish. Now you're gonna see on this side of the face, I got a little too close with the heat gun and it actually started to bubble the clay. But that's okay, I'm gonna give it another thin layer and I'm gonna heat it up again and just fix that area. Also, be very careful, as soon as you apply the heat gun, the clay will stay hot for quite a while, so be careful not to burn yourself while touching it, and that's basically the process. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna finish baking this side of the face, and on the back, I'm gonna retouch this area, and then I'm gonna continue to do the clay for the rest of down here and finish our piece. Alright guys, now that we've covered the 3D print with the polymer clay with the Sculpey, and it's been dry, we've been kind of baked it on with that burnishing tool, it's all ready and set to go for paint. This concludes part 1. Please stay tuned for part 2 where we're going to paint it in that metallic bronze goldish color, and we're going to do the washes over it, and we're going to make it look like an aged bronze kind of small statue. If you liked what you saw, hit the like button below. If you like the channel, hit subscribe. I would truly appreciate your comments. Anything that you can say and suggest to make the channel better are greatly appreciated, guys. Thank you for your time. Stay tuned for part 2 where we paint this bad boy on Big Boy Builds.